The Great Hall of this
Behold
Valiant
the light
Empire
of
did
our
not
realm.
echo. That was the first thing visitors noticed,
Behold
and
the
the
light
last
of
thing
our
they
realm.
forgot. A chamber carved from living crystal, 300 feet high, its walls grown rather than built across 10,000 years of patient cultivation. And yet, when the Empress spoke, her voice did not bounce. It did not travel. It simply arrived, fully formed, in every corner of the room at once, as though the crystal itself had agreed to carry her words wherever she wished them to go. Princess Lyra Voss had stood in this hall 200 times in her 26 years of life. She had never once felt welcome in it. She stood now in the center of the white floor, beneath the great chandelier of blue-white light that hung like a frozen star above the throne. Her silver skin, pale even by Valine standards, caught the light and gave it back cold. Her hands were at her sides. She had decided, walking from her chambers to this room, that her hands would remain at her sides no matter what happened. She would not clasp them. She would not fidget. She would give them nothing to mock. Around the perimeter of the hall, the court watched. There were perhaps 300 of them today, arranged in their careful tiers of rank and alliance, their dark robes and silver jewelry catching the crystal light. Most of them were not looking at her directly. That was the Valine way. You did not stare at something shameful. You simply angled your gaze slightly away so that the object of contempt remained in your peripheral vision, observable but not acknowledged. Lyra had grown up understanding exactly what that particular angle of avoidance meant. She had been the object of that angle since she was 14 years old. On the throne, Empress Varathan sat the way she always sat, as though the throne had been built around her body specifically, as though she and the crystal had reached an arrangement. She was 60 years old and looked 40, the way all Valine royalty did. Her face was flawless, her silver hair coiled in the formal pattern of imperial authority, her eyes the deep violet that marked the oldest bloodlines. She was, by any measure of her civilization, perfect. She was looking somewhere past her third daughter's left shoulder. She had not met Lyra's eyes in 2 years. Lord Dravak stood to the right of the throne, as he always did. He was the Empress's chief advisor, a tall man with a long jaw and the particular kind of stillness that predators develop. Not peace, not calm, but the absolute conservation of energy while waiting to strike. His robes were deep purple, the color reserved for those who had served 3 consecutive empresses. He had served 2. The third robe was presumptuous, and everyone knew it, and no one said anything, because that was also the Valine way. He was the one who spoke first. The human delegation has renewed their request. His voice was measured, precise, like a blade maintained by someone who used it regularly. They ask again for the formal alliance they proposed 18 months ago. They ask again for the joining of houses through marriage, as is their custom. He paused. The pause was not for breath. It was for effect. The Empress, in her wisdom, has decided to grant this request. The court did not react visibly. They were too well trained for that. But Lyra felt the quality of the room's attention shift, the way a current shifts under still water. She felt 300 pairs of eyes move toward her, maintaining that careful angle of not quite looking. She understood immediately. She had understood before the words were finished. There were 3 daughters of the Empress. Valara was the eldest, already positioned as heir, already mother to 2 children, already woven into so many alliances that to move her would have required dismantling half of the empire's political architecture. Miro was the second, beautiful and capable, mother to 3 children, currently negotiating a trade compact that would bring the entire northern sector into the imperial fold. To offer either of them to the humans would have been an actual gesture, a real concession, something that cost something. To offer the third daughter cost nothing. To offer the third daughter was, in fact, a kind of joke. Lyra Voss, third daughter of the Empress, had been examined by the imperial physicians at age 14, at 16, and again at 19. The results had been the same each time. Her reproductive biology was, as the lead physician had written in the official report, non-functional. She would never carry a child. She would never contribute to the bloodline. In a civilization that measured worth almost entirely through biological legacy, this made her, at best, a ceremonial object, kept, displayed on appropriate occasions, then returned to her chambers to be forgotten. She was the Valine Empire's most expensive decoration, and now she was being offered to the humans. The court was not laughing. They were far too composed for actual laughter. But Lyra could feel it underneath the composed faces, the precise postures, the carefully maintained angles of avoidance. The amusement was structural. It was built into the architecture of the moment. The Empress was granting the human request for a princess, yes, but she was sending them the one that didn't work. She was giving them, dressed in the full dignity of imperial ceremony, something the Empire itself had already decided was worthless. And the humans, primitive and emotionally unstable as all the files described them, would likely not even understand the insult. They would accept this broken princess with gratitude, thinking themselves honored, and the Valiant court would watch from across the stars and find it quietly hilarious for years. "You will depart in 3 days," the Empress said. She was still looking at that point past Lyra's left shoulder. "Prepare yourself." The night before she left, Lyra could not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept well since she was 14 years old, since the first physician's report, since the first time she had walked into a room and felt the angle of avoidance already forming around her before she had said a word. She had learned to use the sleepless hours. She read, she studied. She had, over the course of 12 years, read more about human civilization than anyone in the Imperial archives, partly because it was something to do in the dark hours, and partly because the humans were the one thing the court considered too beneath them to monitor, which meant the files on humanity were the only files in the archive that no one else bothered to consult, which meant she could read them without anyone noting that she had. She was in the corridor near the east wing of the palace at the 3rd hour of the night, walking the long route that took her past the administrative chambers, when she heard Lord Drevak's voice through a partially open door. She stopped. In 12 years of navigating the court, Lyra Voss had learned that the most dangerous thing she could do was show that she was paying attention. She had learned to observe without appearing to observe, to listen without appearing to listen, to absorb information through the periphery of her awareness while her face remained pleasantly empty. She had learned this the way animals learn certain behaviors, not through teaching, but through the repeated experience of what happened when you failed to practice it. She stood in the corridor and did not move and kept her breathing shallow. Does not matter which outcome occurs. Drevak's voice, coming through the gap in the door with that particular precision she had known all her life. If the humans reject her, we have demonstrated that even a discarded princess is too refined for their appreciation. If they accept her, we have confirmed what we already know, that their standards are low enough to embarrass themselves with. A pause, the sound of something being poured. Either way, we have given them nothing of value and made them grateful for it. It is a perfect arrangement. A second voice, younger, one of his aides. And if she won't. Drevak's voice was not unkind. It was simply certain, the way a geologist is certain about the age of stone. The reports are clear. She is what she is. The humans will realize this eventually. By then, the alliance will be signed, and it will not matter. The younger voice said nothing more. Lyra stood in the corridor for a long moment after the sounds behind the door returned to the murmur of administrative work. She stood there and felt something move through her, starting in her chest and traveling outward to her fingers, to the silver skin of her arms, to the ends of her hair. It was not grief. She had felt grief at 14, at 16, at 19. She had processed grief until it was smooth and flat and no longer snagged on anything. This was something else. She had spent 12 years being an object of avoidance, of pity, of quiet amusement, of occasional ceremonial utility. She had been moved around the board of the Empire's political life like a piece that everyone agreed had no real value, but that the rules of the game required you to keep on the table. And now Drevak had laid out with perfect clarity exactly what this was. Not a posting, not even a punishment, a joke. A move designed to produce mockery regardless of outcome, because she was the kind of piece you could throw into any position without risk, because she could not change the result of anything. She stood in the corridor and felt that thing move through her and understood what it was. It was refusal, not of the posting. She had no power to refuse the posting, not of the departure, not of the marriage, not of the transport to a world she had never seen. She could not refuse any of those things, and she knew it, and she was not foolish enough to pretend otherwise. but she could refuse the outcome. Dravak had identified two possibilities: rejection or humiliation. He had decided with that geologist's certainty that there was no third option. She was a piece with no move. He had forgotten, Lyra thought, standing very still in the dark corridor with her hands at her sides, that even the pieces that are thrown away can choose what they do when they land. She would not give him either of his outcomes. She did not yet know what the third option was, but she had 12 years of sleepless hours and a habit of reading everything in 12 days on a transport ship to figure it out. She walked back to her chambers without being seen. She did not sleep. But for the first time in a long time, the darkness did not feel like it was pressing inward. Her sisters did not come to say goodbye. This did not surprise her. Valoriso had sent a note through a secretary, brief, correctly formal, the kind of message you send when protocol requires acknowledgement, but presence would imply more significance than you wish to grant. Muriel had sent nothing at all, which was in some ways more honest. The servants helped her pack in silence. They were good servants, trained to discretion, and they had been discreetly avoiding her eyes for years. She did not resent them for it. They were navigating the same court she was, with fewer tools and less protection. She thanked each of them by name when she left. 3 of them looked genuinely startled by this. The departure ceremony was small. For context, when Muriel had departed for the Northern Sector negotiations, there had been a ceremony lasting 4 hours, attended by 3,000 people, with music composed specifically for the occasion. 200 ships had formed an honor formation in orbit above the palace. Today there were 50 people in the secondary departure hall and a single transport vessel waiting on the lower pad, a vessel of the kind used to carry supplies and minor diplomatic parcels to outlying systems. No music, no formation. Dravak gave a brief speech in which the words were all technically correct and the tone communicated clearly that he was performing a minor administrative task. Several courtiers near the back were struggling with expressions that wanted to become smiles. Lyra stood through all of it with her hands at her sides. She watched the faces of the 50 people who had come, cataloging them with the quiet precision she had spent years developing. She was looking for something specific, and she found it in 2 or 3 of the younger courtiers. Not amusement, but something more uncomfortable, a kind of recognition. They were young enough to still feel things like recognition. She filed that away, knowing it might never matter, but filing it anyway, because she had always believed that information kept was information available. The transport lifted smoothly from the lower pad. Lyra sat in her small cabin and watched the Imperial homeworld drop away below her. The blue-purple continents, the silver cities strung along the coastlines like jewelry. The crystal towers of the capital catching the light of the star in long white needles. She had lived there for 26 years. She had been, for most of those years, a ghost in it, present, visible when required, otherwise simply occupying space. She felt no grief at watching it shrink. She felt something more like the particular clarity that arrives when you have been carrying a weight for so long that you forgot you were carrying it, and then something shifts and you feel its absence, and you understand for the first time how heavy it had actually been. She turned from the viewport and opened the human files. She had 12 days. She read. The files on humanity were extensive in volume and thin in insight, which told her a great deal about the people who had written them. Whoever had compiled the imperial intelligence on Earth had been thorough in collecting facts and spectacular in missing the point of them. There were detailed assessments of human technological capacity, accurate as far as she could tell, though somewhat contemptuous in framing. There were population statistics, geopolitical maps, biological analyses that she read with particular attention, noting that the human genetic structure contained what the researchers had called adaptive sequences, regions of the genome that appeared to serve no obvious function in normal human biology, which the researchers had therefore labeled vestigial and moved on from without further inquiry. She noted that the habit of dismissing things that didn't fit the expected category was apparently not unique to the Valine. But what she kept returning to over the 12 days of travel was a section near the end of the files that had clearly been written by someone different from the rest. The language was simpler, less technical. The tone was different, not contemptuous, but something closer to genuinely puzzled. Human pair bonding, the section was titled, appears to operate on principles that remain poorly understood. The researcher had noted, with evident confusion, that humans formed long-term partnerships not primarily on the basis of genetic compatibility or social utility, but on what they called emotional connection. That this connection, which they called love, appeared to function as a primary motivation for major life decisions: where to live, how to work, what to sacrifice, in a way that made little evolutionary sense and yet was stubbornly consistent across almost every human culture on record. That humans would remain with partners who offered them no genetic or material advantage, sometimes for decades, apparently because the presence of that particular person made them experience their own life as more valuable. The researcher had concluded that this was probably a biological compensation mechanism for the species' unusually high mortality rate and had moved on. Lyra read that section 3 times. She had no word in Valine for what the researcher was describing. And she had always found that the things without names were worth the most careful attention. The things the language hadn't caught up to yet. The things that existed in the space before understanding arrived. She saw Earth from the viewport 2 hours before they landed, and she stopped breathing for a moment. She had expected something like the outlying mining worlds, functional, gray-brown, the kind of planet that was valuable for what was in it rather than what it looked like. The files had described a resource-rich world with primitive technological infrastructure and an unstable political climate. She had formed a mental image accordingly. What she saw was blue. Not the cold, crystalline blue of Valine, but something warmer, deeper. Blue that shifted to green at the coastlines, that broke into white spirals of cloud in the upper atmosphere, that darkened over the oceans to something that felt almost alive. The cities caught this light differently than Valine cities, not in long crystal needles, but in scattered organic clusters that suggested something that had grown rather than been designed. The planet looked, from orbit, like something that was still in the middle of becoming itself. Lyra stood at the viewport for a long time, the files closed in her lap, her hands very still, and felt something rise in her that she had no category for in any language she had ever learned. They landed at a facility in the northwest of the continent the humans called North America, not far from a mountain range that the pilot identified as the Rockies. Lyra walked down the ramp into air that hit her like information, complex, layered, full of things she couldn't identify, green and cold in particular, in a way that the controlled atmosphere of the palace had never been. She had prepared herself, walking down the ramp, for a version of the same reception she had always received at home. The not quite looking, the careful angles, the performance of welcome that communicated the precise opposite of welcome. There were 6 people waiting. 5 of them were in the kind of neat, dark uniforms that suggested military function. They stood at attention, watching her with the focused attention of people doing a job. The 6th was standing slightly apart from the others, in ordinary civilian clothes. A dark jacket, worn at the elbows, simple trousers, practical boots. He was tall for a human, with dark hair that had gone gray at the temples in a way that suggested not age but something more specific. The kind of graying that happens when a person has spent time under sustained pressure. His face was lined around the eyes, not deeply, but in the way that comes from years of a particular expression. The lines around the eyes of someone who had smiled often and meant it. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been tired for a long time and have gotten used to it. The particular tiredness of someone who lost something they were not expecting to lose and has been navigating the world without it ever since. He stepped forward. He bowed. Not the fractional nod of diplomatic obligation. Not the precisely calibrated angle of someone calculating exactly how much deference they were required to offer. A real bow, unhurried, complete, the kind that you only perform when you actually mean it. He straightened and met her eyes. Princess Lyra. His voice was warm, not effusive, not performed, simply warm, the way a room is warm when someone has been living in it. Welcome to Earth. My name is Callum Rains. I hope we can make this a good place for you. Lyra looked at him. She had prepared herself for contempt. She had prepared herself for thinly disguised disappointment, for the particular expression of people who have received something they didn't want and are maintaining politeness about it. She had her responses ready. She had built them carefully over 12 days. She had not prepared herself for genuine welcome. It disarmed her more thoroughly than any hostility could have. "Thank you," she said, because it was the only thing available. He smiled. It reached his eyes. He said, "There's no rush on any of it. Let's get you settled first." The house sat on a hill surrounded by mountains, which she had not expected. She had expected a government facility, something clinical and controlled, with the feel of a project. What Callum Rains had apparently been given, or had chosen, she wasn't yet sure which, was a house built from wood, with a wide porch facing west, surrounded by the kind of land that had not been planned. Trees that had grown where they had decided to grow, a creek somewhere below, audible at night, mountains on three sides, their peaks still carrying snow in the middle of what the humans called spring. The house was small by any standard she had known. Her personal chambers in the palace had been larger than the entire ground floor. But there was something in the proportion of it, the way it sat in relation to the landscape around it, that made the word small feel wrong. A better word might have been exact, like it had been arrived at rather than built. Callum carried her cases inside and showed her the room that would be hers, its own entrance, its own windows, its own view of the eastern ridge. He pointed out the things she would need to know: how to work the heating, where the extra blankets were kept, how the light switches operated, which light switches controlled the exterior. He explained these things with the straightforward matter-of-factness of someone who had thought about what would actually be useful to know. Then he walked her to the main room and stopped. On the wall near the window, among a small collection of photographs of landscapes and mountains, in one of a bird she didn't recognize, there was a single-frame photograph of a human woman. Brown hair, a wide smile. Caught in a moment of pure, unguarded happiness, laughing at something just outside the frame. "That's Claire," Callum said from behind her. His voice was quiet, steady but quiet in the specific way that things are quiet when they have been through a period of not being quiet and have come out the other side. "My wife, she passed away 5 years ago." Lyra turned to look at him. "She would have liked this," he added. He was looking at the photograph, not at her, with an expression that she recognized. Not grief, exactly. Not any longer. Something more like the way a person looks at something that cost them greatly and that they have nonetheless decided not to regret. The whole situation, I mean. She had a way of finding the interesting thing in any situation. "I'm sorry," Lyra said. She meant it. She surprised herself by meaning it. Callum nodded once, the way people nod when they have been offered something genuine and want to receive it correctly. "Thank you," he said. Nora Calloway arrived the next morning. She came through the front door without knocking, which apparently was normal here, carrying a container of something that smelled extraordinary and wearing the expression of a person on a mission. She had red hair pulled back in a practical arrangement and brown eyes that moved quickly and noticed things. She taught at the local school, which was 20 minutes down the mountain road. She had lived on the adjacent property for 7 years and had, she explained in the first 3 minutes of conversation, been looking forward to having a neighbor who wasn't Callum, because Callum was good company, but he worked too much and didn't talk enough. Callum from the kitchen said, "She's not wrong." Nora set the container down on the table, looked at Lyra with the direct assessment of someone who was making up her mind quickly and said, "What do you like to eat in the morning? Not what you're supposed to eat, not what's diplomatic. What do you actually want?" Lyra blinked. In 26 years, no one had asked her that. She thought about it seriously because the question deserved to be treated seriously. "Something warm," she said finally. "I don't know what." "We'll figure it out," Nora said, already opening the container. "That's what this week is for." Lyra sat down at the table in Callum Rains' kitchen, in a house made of wood on a hill in Montana, surrounded by mountains that had grown without planning, and a woman with red hair was explaining the difference between 3 kinds of eggs. And somewhere below the window there was a creek she hadn't seen yet, and the air through the open door smelled like spring and cold stone, and something green she had no name for. She did not understand what she was feeling, but she stayed with it, the way she stayed with all things that mattered. Quietly, without rushing toward a conclusion. 3 weeks in, she found the journal. It was not hidden. That was the thing she would come back to later, turning it over in her mind. It was not hidden. It had simply been left on the side table in the main room, open to a page the way books are left when someone has been reading and been interrupted by something ordinary. She had not been looking for it. She had been crossing the room to get her own reading from the shelf on the far wall, and she had glanced down, the way you glance at things in passing, and the handwriting had caught her eye because it was Callum's, which she had seen on documents and notes in the weeks since her arrival, and she had registered it before she could choose not to. She read 2 sentences. She stood still for a moment. Then she walked to her shelf, took her book, and left the room. But the 2 sentences stayed with her. The way sentences stay with you when they reach through and make contact with something you thought was well protected. I'm afraid I'll start to care about her, and I'm more afraid of finding out that I won't let myself. She sat in her room for a long time that evening, watching the eastern ridge go dark as the sun set behind the opposite mountains. He was not a threat. He was not a diplomat running a calculation. He was not performing welcome in order to get something from her. He was a man who had lost the person he loved and was sitting with his own fear in a handwritten journal and had left it open on the table, not because he was careless, but because people who live alone in houses on hills sometimes forget that someone else might be in the room. He was, she realized, frightened of the same thing she was, not of her specifically, not of Valine or politics or the weight of what this arrangement meant, but of the simpler, more ordinary danger, of letting someone matter, of caring about a person who was in any way uncertain, of surviving one loss and then voluntarily stepping toward the possibility of another. She understood that fear with every part of her that had spent 12 years keeping its hands at its sides. She had not expected to find someone who was also, in their own way, protecting themselves from the same thing. Outside the window, the Montana night was coming in cold and clear, and the stars were appearing one by one in the dark above the ridge. Some of them were stars she knew. Some of them she didn't. Somewhere in the direction she was looking, so far away that the light took years to arrive, was the blue-purple homeworld that had decided she was nothing. She was not nothing. She had known that abstractly for a long time. But sitting in a room in a house on a hill, with the smell of spring through the window and a journal on a table in the next room, and a man who was frightened of caring, she was beginning to know it in the way that becomes permanent. She did not sleep that night either, but the night held no weight. It was simply the space before a day that hadn't arrived yet. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Lyra Voss found herself wanting to see what the day would bring. Spring became summer the way things become themselves in Montana, not through announcement, but through accumulation. The snow retreated up the eastern ridge in increments so gradual that Lyra only noticed the change when she looked at a photograph Nora had taken in the first week of her arrival and compared it to the view outside the window on a morning in late May. In the photograph, the ridge was white from midpoint to peak. Outside the window, the white had become a narrow band near the summit, holding on the way things hold on when they know they are losing but are not ready to concede. She understood that kind of holding on. She had been watching the seasons change with the specific attention of someone who has never had seasons before. Valine had climate, controlled, calibrated, adjusted by atmospheric management systems that had been running for so long that the citizens had forgotten they were running. On the homeworld, the temperature in the capital varied by exactly 4 degrees across the full year. The light changed by 8% between the longest and shortest days. Everything else was constant. Montana was not constant. Montana was, as best as Lyra could determine, constitutionally opposed to the concept of constant. The weather arrived without notification. The creek below the house, she had found it in the second week, following the sound through a quarter-mile of pine forest, ran high and fast in the snowmelt and slowed to something contemplative by midsummer. The animals moved through the property according to schedules she could not decode, appearing and disappearing on logic she hadn't yet learned to read. A pair of eagles nested on the north ridge. She watched them most mornings from the porch with the coffee that Nora had taught her to make, and she found that watching them, the way they rode the thermals, the way they found lift in the invisible architecture of the air, gave her something she could not name but increasingly could not imagine doing without. Callum noticed her watching them one morning in the first week of June. He came out onto the porch with his own coffee and stood beside her without speaking, following her line of sight to where the larger of the 2 eagles was working the updraft off the south face. "They've nested there for 4 years," he said after a while. "Claire used to track them, kept a notebook. Did she have names for them?" He smiled. It was the kind of smile that contains something it's not fully showing. "She named them Thatcher and Roosevelt. She had opinions about eagles." "What kind of opinions?" "She thought they were overconfident." He sipped his coffee. She said anything that made that much noise about being impressive was compensating for something. Lyra looked at the eagle, which was, at that moment, executing a turn that seemed designed primarily to demonstrate how well it could execute a turn. She wasn't wrong, Lyra said. Callum laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was the real kind. The kind that happens faster than a person can manage it, and it went out across the morning air and into the trees and came back changed into something lighter. Lyra held her coffee in both hands and kept her eyes on the eagles and felt something happening in her chest that she had no framework for and was, for once, not in a hurry to classify. The rhythm of the days built itself slowly, the way all real structures build, without a moment you could point to as the beginning, simply a gradual accumulation of form. Callum worked from home most mornings, sitting at the broad table near the south window with his translated documents and his careful, patient attention to the gaps between what one culture meant and what another culture heard. He was good at his work. She could tell that not from any credential or performance, but from the way he approached a problem. He would sit with it, turn it, leave it alone, return to it. He had the habit of someone who trusted that understanding took time and was therefore worth giving time to. In the afternoons, he would often ask her questions, not about Valine politics, not about imperial military capacity or territorial borders, or the things she had noticed the government officials watching her for when they'd come to the house in her second week. He asked about the things that had made him curious while translating, the way the Valine word for honor was built from the same root as their word for visibility, which meant that to be honorable in Valine was structurally the same as being seen. The way the formal register of the language contained no second-person singular, only second-person collective, so that to address a single person formally required you to speak to them as though they were a group, which Lyra had always found isolating in a way she couldn't explain, and which Callum found fascinating. "You're being addressed as a committee," he said one afternoon, leaning back from the table, "instead of a person." "Always," she said. "That sounds exhausting." "It is," she said, and heard in her own voice the flatness of something that has been true for so long that the person stating it had stopped noticing it was remarkable. Callum noticed. She could see him notice. He did not say anything further, which was the correct response. Not the absence of understanding, but the presence of enough understanding to know when adding words would only make the space smaller. She found in those afternoon conversations that she was talking more than she had talked to anyone in years. Not because she had been unable to talk, but because she had been without someone who listened in the particular way that Callum listened. Not waiting for a gap to respond in, but actually following the thread of what she was saying, all the way to the end, wherever it went. It was an uncommon thing she was beginning to realize, more uncommon than she had known to look for. Nora brought her into the town in the third week of June. The nearest town was small enough that Lyra could have mapped it in an afternoon, which she eventually did. Not from strategic habit, she told herself, but from the same instinct that made her want to know where the creek went and why the Eagles preferred the south updraft. The town had a grocery, a hardware store, a diner with 9 tables that was apparently the actual center of all social activity, a small library that the librarian, a woman named Dolores who was approximately 70 and had the bearing of someone who had read enough to feel at home anywhere, kept with the dedication of someone tending a living thing. The people were, in aggregate, curious about her. They were not uniformly graceful about their curiosity. There was a man in the hardware store who stared at her silver skin with the transparent fascination of someone who had been told it was rude to stare and was attempting to reconcile this with a very strong desire to stare. There was a woman outside the diner who asked Nora, while Lyra was standing directly beside Nora, whether she spoke English, which Lyra answered by responding to the question before Nora could. But mostly they were something she had not expected, which was ordinary. They asked about ordinary things. A farmer named Earl, who was apparently a fixture of the diner on Tuesday mornings, asked her whether she thought the weather on her homeworld was better or worse than Montana weather. And when she said it was more consistent, he nodded sagely and said that consistency was overrated and went back to his eggs. A group of children from the school where Nora taught saw her on the main street and asked to touch her silver hair. And when she bent down so they could reach, one of them, a boy of perhaps 8 with a look of profound scientific seriousness, announced that it felt like regular hair but fancier, which struck her as entirely accurate. She was not invisible here, but she was visible in the right way. Seen as a person, curious about, occasionally awkward around, but not avoided. Not angled away from, not categorized as a problem to be managed. She had not known, until she experienced its absence, how much of her energy had always gone into maintaining equilibrium in the face of the other kind of being seen. She told him in July. They had been cooking dinner together, which had become the architecture of evenings in the house on the hill, Callum handling the parts that required precision and heat, Lyra gradually taking over the sauces, which she had discovered she had an aptitude for, possibly because sauce making was primarily about balance, and she had spent her entire life calibrating balance. They had been talking about nothing in particular. The Eagles, a translation problem he was working through, something Nora had said at dinner the previous week that had been funny in a way that kept recurring to Lyra. The kitchen was warm, and the light was the long golden light of July evening, coming through the window at a low angle and catching the steam from the pot on the stove. She set down the spoon. He looked at her. She had been planning to say it differently. She had, in her careful way, constructed several versions of the conversation, considered their various trajectories, prepared responses to the responses she anticipated. She had been intending to be precise and clear and to manage the moment with the same control she brought to everything. Instead, she said, "I need you to understand something about why they sent me." He turned to face her and gave her his full attention, which was the kind of full attention that felt like the room getting quieter. "The physicians examined me 3 times," she said. "Once at 14, once at 16, once at 19. Each time the conclusion was the same. My reproductive biology is—" She paused, not from emotion, but from the familiar awareness of how differently the word landed in the Valine context, where it was not a medical fact, but a verdict. Non-functional. "I cannot have children. By Valine standards, this makes me without value. It is why they sent me. Not as an honor, not as a real gesture. You were given their discarded piece because they calculated it cost them nothing and would humiliate you by association." The kitchen was quiet except for the pot on the stove. Callum looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, not with the recalibrating expression of someone adjusting their assessment. He looked at her the way he looked at the translation problems he was most interested in, carefully with complete attention, trying to understand what was actually being said beneath what was being said. "I know," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I mean, I didn't know the specific details, but I knew it wasn't a real gesture. I was briefed on the political situation before you arrived." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that it didn't change anything about how I approach this. It didn't change anything about how I thought about you." "Why not?" He considered that, not as a rhetorical question, but as a real one. "Because the insult wasn't aimed at you," he said. "You weren't the joke. You were the delivery mechanism for the joke, which is a different thing. And also, by them." He stopped, seemed to locate the words more carefully. "You are not what you can or cannot produce. You are the person who has been in this house for 4 months. I know who that person is. I don't need a different accounting system." Lyra had prepared in her careful planning for several versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for "I know who that person is." She felt something that had been braced for a very long time quietly stop bracing, and the release of it moved through her in a way that felt like the first deep breath after a long time of shallow ones. "You are not broken," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "You are not damaged goods or a discarded piece or any other category that they put you in. You are Lyra Voss. I have been watching you become more yourself every week since you arrived, and that person is remarkable. I would like, if that's all right, for you to know that someone sees that." "It's all right," she said. The government men came on a Tuesday. There were 4 of them, in the unmarked vehicles that were not quite as unmarked as they apparently believed, and they arrived at 10 in the morning without prior arrangement. Callum was out, driving to the county seat for something administrative, and Lyra was on the porch with her coffee and the Eagles when the vehicles came up the road. She watched them come. She did not go inside. She did not call Callum. She set down her coffee, took a breath of Montana morning air, cold even in July at this elevation, thin and clean and full of pine, and walked to the top of the porch steps and waited. The lead man was in his 40s with the careful, neutral expression of someone trained to deliver information without appearing to be delivering information. He introduced himself with a name she didn't bother to commit to memory and an agency designation that she recognized from the briefing files she had read on the ship. Princess Lyra, he said, we'd like to discuss a research opportunity. Tell me what you're proposing, she said. He outlined it. A biological study, Mom. Non-invasive, he said several times with the frequency of someone who had been told to say it, focused on Valine physiological adaptation. Participation would be voluntary, he said, also several times. They would compensate her for her time. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, how long have you been monitoring this property? A brief pause. I'm not sure what you... I have been here for 4 months, she said. I have been watching this approach road for 4 months. Because I have a habit of watching approaches, and it is a habit I see no reason to abandon. The vehicle you arrived in today has been on this road twice before. Early morning, both times pausing at the tree line. I know what monitoring looks like. I grew up in an imperial court. She looked at him steadily. I am not asking this as a complaint. I am asking because I prefer to conduct conversations on accurate premises. The man's neutral expression held, but something behind it recalibrated. There has been some observation, he acknowledged. I understand why, she said. I am an asset of significant interest, and your government's instinct to assess and understand that asset is rational. I don't resent rational behavior. She paused. Here is what I propose. I will cooperate with a cultural exchange program, knowledge of Valine language, customs, biological science. I will participate in documented conversations with qualified researchers. I will do this on a schedule determined by me, for durations determined by me, with a research team of no more than 4 people at any one session, and with full right to end any session at any time without explanation. She watched him process this. In exchange, she continued, the monitoring of this property ends today, not reduced, ended. And these conversations, she indicated the 4 of them, the vehicles, the implicit structure of the approach, go through me directly, not through my husband. The pause this time was longer. Your cooperation in the terms you've described would be acceptable, he said finally. I'm glad to hear it, she said. I'll have my first availability in 2 weeks. Please send the team's credentials before then. She walked back to the porch, picked up her coffee, and watched them drive back down the road. When Callum returned an hour later, she told him what had happened. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Are you all right? He said. I'm fine. I know, she said, but this one was mine to handle. He looked at her, and something in his expression settled into something new. Not surprise, not concern. Something that looked like the particular stillness of a person who has just fully understood something they had been in the process of understanding for a while. Okay, he said. It was the right answer. She was the one who asked him to marry her in the last week of August. She had been thinking about it for a month. Not in the calculating way she had thought about many things. Not as a strategy or a structure or a managed outcome. She had been thinking about it the way she had learned to think about the eagles, or the creek, or the way the light changed on the eastern ridge as summer tipped toward fall, with the particular attention you give to something you don't want to rush because you want to understand it fully before it changes. She had read that passage in the human files many times over the months. The one the confused researcher had written about love, about pair bonding based on emotional connection, about staying with someone not because it made biological or material sense, but because their presence made you experience your own life as more valuable. She understood it now. Not abstractly, not as an anthropological observation about a species she had been assigned to. She understood it from inside it, from the morning coffees and the evening sauces and the afternoon conversations that went places neither of them had planned, from the way she had watched him learn her and had let herself be learned, from the way that sitting on the porch of that house on that home had stopped feeling like an assignment and started feeling like the only place she currently needed to be. She told him in the evening, on the porch, with the fall light coming down gold across the ridge. She said it plainly because she had learned in the 8 months since her arrival that the things worth saying deserve plain saying. I would like to be married to you, not as an arrangement, as a choice. He was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. That is what I want too, he said. The wedding was small. Nora was the witness. There were 6 neighbors because Nora had told 6 people, and Nora was constitutionally incapable of keeping things entirely to herself, which was one of the many things Lyra had come to appreciate about her. The ceremony was in the garden in September, when the aspens had turned gold and the mountains behind the house had their first new snow on the upper peaks. There was no imperial ceremony, there were no officials, there was no acknowledgement from Valos. It was the first ceremony of her life that Lyra had been fully present in. She fainted in the kitchen on a morning in late October. She had been making the sauce, the one she had developed over the summer, layering flavors the way she had learned to layer information, with patience and sequence, when the room tilted. She did not fall. She caught the edge of the counter and held on, which was, she would think later, a very characteristic response to crisis. But she was pale when Callum found her a minute later, and she could not stand without the counter's assistance, and the dizziness persisted through the morning. Dr. Margaret Holt ran the clinic 20 minutes down the mountain. She was a compact, efficient woman who had treated Lyra twice before, once for a reaction to a local plant she had touched without knowing what it was, once for a persistent cold that had turned out to be an allergic response to something in the fall pollen. Both times she had approached Lyra's alien physiology with the methodical adaptability of someone who enjoyed problems that didn't have existing answers. She ran the initial tests in the morning. She called Dr. Ethan Cross in the early afternoon. Ethan Cross drove 2 hours from his facility in the city, arriving in the late afternoon with equipment Lyra recognized from the files: xenobiological assessment tools, genetic scanners, the kind of diagnostic technology that had been developed specifically for the growing field of non-human biological research. They ran the tests a second time, then a third. Lyra sat on the examination table and watched the 2 doctors speak in low voices with the body language of people who are rechecking their work, not because they were uncertain of their methodology, but because they are uncertain their methodology can be producing the result it is producing. Callum sat in the chair beside the table. He had not left the chair since they arrived. His hand was near hers on the table surface, not quite touching, available. Dr. Holt came and stood in front of them. She had the expression of a person who has been in medicine long enough to have learned to deliver extraordinary news with steadiness, and who is currently being tested on that skill more severely than any previous occasion. Lyra, she said, you're pregnant. The room received this information. Lyra heard it enter her awareness and felt her entire nervous system make some kind of adjustment, like a building shifting on its foundation, not falling, but changing its relationship to the ground. That is not possible, she said. The words came out level, which surprised her. The Valine physicians. I know, Margaret said. We ran the tests 3 times because of that. The result is consistent. You are approximately 6 weeks pregnant. She paused. The fetus appears healthy. Ethan Cross came to stand beside Margaret. He turned his tablet so Lyra could see the genetic scan on the screen. We need you to look at this, he said, and his voice had the quality of someone who has stumbled into the territory of their life's work and is still adjusting to the altitude of it. The human genome has sequences that we've been classifying as non-functional for decades. We never understood their purpose. They appear, in this case, to be serving as compatibility bridges, interfaces between Callum's genetic structure and yours. They are activating sequences in your genome that every Valine assessment has categorized as dormant. Lyra looked at the scan. She was a person who had spent her life reading things carefully, including technical things, and she understood what she was looking at. They said the sequences were inactive, she said slowly. They were inactive, Ethan said, in every Valine biological context they had ever encountered. But inactive doesn't mean permanently non-functional. It means, he paused, looking for the right framing, that the right key hadn't been tried yet. The room was quiet. Callum had not moved. She could feel his absolute stillness beside her. The Valine physicians were not wrong, Ethan continued carefully. By every standard they had available, you were infertile, but their standards didn't account for this. They couldn't have. They'd never encountered it. He looked at her with the gentle directness of a person delivering something they have decided she deserves to receive straight. You were not broken, Lyra. You were unmatched. Those are not the same thing. You were not broken. You were unmatched. She had been told she was broken at 14 years old, in a formal medical report that her mother had read and that had determined the entire trajectory of her life from that moment. She had been told it at 16 and 19, and in the angle of every gaze in the great crystal hall for 12 years. She placed her hand on her abdomen, very slowly. The way you place your hand on something you are still accepting is real. She had no words. In any language she knew, she had no words for this. She sent the message to Valos that evening. She drafted it at the table near the south window, in the formal register of Valine diplomatic communication, while the mountains outside went dark in the early November twilight. She wrote carefully because she was always careful, and because this particular message deserved care. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that she had established a life on Earth. She wrote that she was pregnant, without specifying the father's species, because she wanted to control the sequence in which information arrived. She sent it through the official Imperial channel, marked for the Empress's direct office. The acknowledgement came 20 hours later, the standard delay for transmission across the distance between Earth and Valos. It was a brief, automated confirmation from the Imperial Communication Office. What came 6 hours after the acknowledgement was not automated. A second message, bearing the seal not of the Empress's office, but of the Imperial Advisory Council. Bearing Lord Dravak's personal authorization code. Lyra read it twice. A full delegation would be dispatched to Earth to verify the claim. A medical team of Imperial physicians would conduct a comprehensive examination. The delegation would arrive within the standard travel period, 12 days. She read the authorization code again. Dravak, not the Empress. The Empress would have had to receive the message first, would have had to review it, assess it, and make a decision about how to respond. The standard process for a message of this significance, a message informing the throne that an imperial princess was pregnant, would have required the Empress's direct authorization for any official response. Dravak had not waited for the Empress's authorization. He had used his own. Lyra sat with this for a long time, turning it over with the same careful attention she brought to things that mattered. Then she understood. The Empress did not yet know about this message, or she knew and had not yet responded through her own channel. Either way, Dravak had moved first, had committed resources, had set a trajectory in motion. He had taken, as he had always taken, the authority that was not formally his and simply used it before anyone could tell him not to. He was not coming to verify a pregnancy. He was coming because the situation had become interesting again, and Dravak was only interested in situations he could control. He had thrown her away. He had watched his perfect arrangement produce an imperfect result. And now he was coming to correct the outcome, to find the lever that would restore the situation to something he recognized. 12 days. She looked at the eastern ridge through the window. The mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky. Below the house, the creek was running low in the early winter, quieter than in spring, saying less. She placed her hand on her abdomen. She thought about the night in the palace corridor, the voice through the open door. Whether the humans reject her or accept her, we win either way. He had been certain, geologists certain, he had been wrong. She thought about Nova, a name she had been carrying in her mind for weeks without knowing she was carrying it, the way you sometimes know the name of something before you know it. Nova. Something new and bright, something that had not existed before and now did irreversibly. She was not broken. She was not a piece without a move. And in 12 days, Lord Dravak was coming to her house, on her mountain, in her country, and she was going to be ready. Callum came to sit beside her at the table without being asked, the way he had learned to come, the way she had learned to let him. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything. And when she finished, he reached over and placed his hand over hers, not on her abdomen, but on the table, on her hand, the simple contact of one person choosing to be next to another in a moment that mattered. 12 days, he said. 12 days, she said. They sat together in the warm kitchen of the house on the hill, while outside the Montana winter came in slow and cold and certain. And somewhere above them, the stars were appearing one by one, and one of them, in a direction she knew but could no longer call home, was getting closer. She was ready. The ship appeared in the sky above Montana on a Tuesday morning, and the Eagles did not react to it at all. Lyra noticed this from the porch, where she had been sitting since first light with her coffee and the particular kind of stillness she had been cultivating over the 12 days since Dravak's message arrived. The Eagles rode their thermals off the south face with the same unhurried authority they brought to every morning. Indifferent to the craft ascending through the cloud layer above the ridge, a Valine diplomatic vessel of the first class, its hull catching the thin November sunlight in long blue-white lines that looked from below like a moving piece of the sky being peeled back to show something beneath. It was the most Valine thing she had seen in 11 months. It made her feel nothing she hadn't already prepared for. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could hear Callum making breakfast with the quiet efficiency he brought to everything domestic. The soft sound of the pan, the particular rhythm of his movements in a kitchen he knew by memory. He had not asked her this morning how she was feeling. He had asked her last night, and she had answered honestly. And this morning he was making breakfast because that was what was useful, and Callum Rains had a deep instinct for what was useful. She watched the ship descend toward the federal facility 20 miles south, where the government had spent the past 12 days setting up an examination suite that combined, at her specific request, the full diagnostic equipment of an Earth Xenobiological Research Center with the Valine medical instruments that Dravak's advanced team had transmitted specifications for. She had made this request not because she was being cooperative, but because she understood that the examination needed to be unimpeachable. Whatever conclusion it reached, it needed to be the kind of conclusion that no one anywhere in the galaxy could call incomplete. She had spent 12 days preparing for a conversation. She was ready. She drank the rest of her coffee, stood, and went inside to have breakfast with her husband. The delegation was larger than she had imagined. There were 12 people in the formal receiving area of the federal facility when Lyra and Callum arrived. Imperial physicians in their white diagnostic coats, 2 court functionaries in the dark robes of administrative rank, a security detail of 4 who stood with the particular quality of stillness that indicated they were serious, and at the center of it all, exactly where she had expected him to be, Lord Dravak. He was older than she remembered. Not much. A year was not long for a Valine, but there was something in the quality of his stillness that was different from the calculating patience she had known in the palace corridors. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a situation to resolve itself in a particular direction and had been surprised each time it declined to. Beside him stood High Physician Sorath. Sorath was the oldest person in the room by a significant measure. He was 73 years old, which for a Valine meant he occupied the territory of genuine elderhood, a body that showed its years in the specific and dignified way of someone who had lived carefully and was not trying to hide the evidence. He had delivered her third examination at 19 with the grave precision of a man who took no pleasure in his conclusions. She remembered his face from that day. It had been the face of someone doing something he believed necessary and did not enjoy. He met her eyes when she entered and held them for a moment. She could not read what was in them yet. She filed it away. The last member of the delegation came through a door to the left as Lyra was completing her assessment of the room. Princess Miriel. Her sister was exactly as Lyra remembered, composed and finished in the way of a person who had never had reason to be otherwise. Her silver hair in the formal coil, her posture the posture of someone who had been taught from birth how to occupy a room. She was 41 years old and had 3 children, in a trade compact, in a life that had been constructed entirely according to the specifications of the Empire. She looked at Lyra, and Lyra saw something in her sister's face that she had not expected and did not know what to do with yet. She looked like she had been carrying something heavy for a longer time and had not told anyone. There was no time then for that. Dravak was already moving forward, already arranging himself into the posture of authority, already performing the version of this meeting he had scripted on the 12-day crossing. Princess Lyra, he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered. The blade maintained. We have come to verify your claim. You have come to conduct a medical examination, she said, which I have prepared for. The facilities are through there. She indicated the door to the examination suite with a tilt of her head, the gesture clean and unhurried. I suggest we begin. The examination took 4 hours. Lyra lay on the examination table while Valine physicians and human physicians moved around her with the careful choreography of professionals who have agreed, at least for the duration of a shared task, to treat each other as colleagues. Margaret Holt and Ethan Cross worked with the practiced ease of people who knew what they were looking at and how to explain it. The Valine physicians worked with the focused intensity of people who were expecting to find a discrepancy and were becoming, as the hours passed, increasingly unable to find one. Callum sat in the chair beside the table. He had been asked by one of the court functionaries whether he wished to wait outside. He had looked at the functionary for a moment in the mild, unhurried way he had, and said that he would stay where he was, and that had been the end of that conversation. Lyra kept her eyes mostly on the ceiling, or on the scan readouts when the physicians turned them toward her, or on the window where the Montana sky was doing what it did in November, moving through states of gray and white, an occasional thin blue with the complete indifference of weather that has been weather for a very long time and does not require an audience. She felt the baby move once, midway through the examination. A small flutter, distinct and unmistakable, like a question being asked from a place where questions hadn't been possible before. She did not react visibly, but she placed her hand briefly on her abdomen, just for a moment, and felt what she always felt when she did. A settling, like the world confirming a fact she was still learning to fully believe. High Physician Sorath was the last to examine the scans. He stood at the display table for a long time, longer than any of the others, going through each image with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that thoroughness is its own form of respect. His face went through several states that Lyra watched from the table. Focused, uncertain, focused again. Then something she had not seen on a Valine face in a medical context before. Wonder. He turned from the display. He looked at Lyra. He looked at the scans. He looked at Callum, really looked at him for the first time, as a subject of genuine interest rather than a category to be assessed and filed. "The child is healthy," he said. His voice was quiet, careful with the words the way a person is careful with something breakable. "The pregnancy is progressing correctly for the hybrid physiology. There are no anomalies of concern." A pause. "The genetic bridging is unlike anything in the Valine medical literature. The human adaptive sequences are—" He paused again, searching for a word that didn't exist in the formal register. "Remarkable." "Then your examination is complete," Lyra said. "It is," Sorath said. She sat up from the table with Callum's steadying hand at her back, and she looked at the room, at the physicians, at the functionaries, at the 12 people who had traveled 12 days to verify that she had done the impossible, and she felt the particular quality of a moment that has landed exactly where you positioned yourself to receive it. Then Dravak spoke. He had been quiet through the 4 hours of examination with the quality of stillness she had always associated with him. Conserved energy. Waiting. She had felt him waiting the entire time, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. "The examination confirms the pregnancy," he said. His voice was the same. "The blade. It confirms the hybrid nature of the child. It confirms that the child carries Valine imperial bloodlines." He paused, and the pause was the kind she had grown up with. Structural, designed. Under Valine imperial succession law, Article 14, Clause 3, any child carrying a confirmed imperial bloodline, regardless of the circumstances of conception or the location of birth, is considered a ward of the Empire and is subject to return to Velos for— No. The word came out of Lyra before she had chosen it, or perhaps she had chosen it months ago, and this was simply when it arrived. She did not raise her voice. She did not change her posture. She stood on her own feet, Callum's hand no longer at her back because she had stepped slightly forward, a half step, enough to be the forward edge of the room. "No," she said again, and her voice was even and certain, the way the mountains outside were certain. Not because they were fighting anything, but because they were what they were and had been for long enough that the question of whether they would continue to be had stopped being relevant. She looked at Dravak. She had looked away from him in small increments, her entire life. From the angle of avoidance she had learned in the great crystal hall, from the habit of reducing her visibility in the presence of people who could use what they saw against her. She had looked away from him in corridors and ceremonies and in the systematic, years-long experience of being assessed as worthless by people who never looked quite directly at the thing they were assessing. She did not look away now. "You sent me to this planet because you had decided I was worthless," she said. "You packaged that decision as diplomacy. You stood in the departure hall and gave a speech about representation while the court found it privately funny. You calculated that regardless of what happened to me, you would benefit from the outcome." She kept her eyes on his. "I heard you say it the night before I left. I was in the corridor outside the administrative chamber, and I heard every word." The room was very quiet. "You were wrong," she said simply. "Not about me, specifically you. You were wrong about what it meant to throw something away. When you discard something, you lose authority over it. You do not get to come back a year later and invoke succession law over a child who would not exist if you had not made the decision to send me here. You do not get to claim what you threw away." She paused. "My daughter is not a ward of the Empire. She is my child. She was born from the life I built in the place you sent me to disappear. You have no claim on her, you have no claim on me, and you are currently standing in the United States of America, where your succession law carries no weight, in a facility provided by a government that is disinclined to let you leave with an American resident's child." She had known for the past 12 days that this moment was coming. She had thought about it the way she thought about all important things, carefully from all angles, including the angles that frightened her. She was not frightened. She realized the clearest she had felt in her entire adult life. Dravak looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not simple anger, not the crude machinery of a man whose plan had failed. Something more complicated. Something that looked like a person encountering a version of a situation they had thought they fully understood and finding out they had been missing a dimension the entire time. He said nothing. It was High Physician Sorath who moved next. The old physician stepped forward from his place by the display table. He moved with the deliberateness of age and intention combined, and he positioned himself beside Lyra, not behind Dravak. And the room registered this movement with the particular attention that rooms give to things that cannot be undone. "I examined this woman at 19 years old," Sorath said. He was addressing the room, not any individual in it. His voice had the quality of someone making a statement for a permanent record. "I wrote a report that categorized her biological capacity as non-functional. I believe the report was accurate. It was, by every standard available to Valine medical science at the time, an accurate report." He paused. "I was wrong." He turned to look at the genetic scans still displayed on the monitor. "I have studied genetics for 70 years. I have written the foundational texts on Valine reproductive biology that are still taught in the Imperial Medical Academies. I have believed, with the confidence of a person who has spent 7 decades in a field, that I understood the boundaries of what was possible." He looked at the scans for a long moment. "This child has taught me otherwise." He turned to face Dravak directly. "The medical basis for any claim under succession, Article 14, requires that the child's existence represents a continuation of imperial biological capability," Sorath said. "This child does not represent a continuation of imperial biological capability. This child represents a capability that the Empire does not possess and has never possessed. What happened here could not have happened on Valos. It happened here, with this man in this country, because of biological properties specific to humanity. The Empire has no claim on the product of a capability it does not own." The silence in the room was the kind that arrives when something has been said that everyone present knows they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Dravak looked at Sorath. "You would go on record," he said quietly. "I already have," Sorath said. "I transmitted my full examination findings to the Imperial Medical Registry this morning with my personal authentication. They are part of the permanent scientific record." He paused. "I have been wrong before, Dravak. I prefer to be the one who says so." The court functionaries exchanged glances in the rapid, contained way of people running calculations they hadn't expected to need. The security detail remained still, which meant whoever had briefed them had not briefed them for this version of events. Dravak was quiet for a long moment. The stillness of him had changed. It was no longer the waiting stillness, the conserved predator's stillness. It was the stillness of a man standing in a room where every exit was located somewhere he had not planned for. He looked at Lyra once more. She held his gaze and said nothing because nothing more needed to be said. He turned and walked toward the exit, and the functionaries followed, and the security detail followed, and the delegation rearranged itself in his wake and moved out of the room, and the door closed behind them. Lyra stood in the quiet of the room and breathed. Callum's hand found hers. She held it and stayed standing and breathed. Muriel came to the house that evening. She came alone without announcement, in a vehicle she had borrowed from the facility, driving up the mountain road with the cautious unfamiliarity of someone who had never driven a mountain road and was applying excessive concentration to the task. Lyra watched her park from the kitchen window, with the slightly crooked result of someone who had done the best they could with an unfamiliar instrument. She met her sister on the porch. They stood there for a moment in the last of the November light, and Lyra looked at Muriel's face, and Muriel looked at hers, and the 12 years in the ocean of uncrossed distance between them was there in the air, not gone, not pretended away, but present in the way that things can be present and still not be permanent. "I don't know how to start this," Muriel said. "You already started it," Lyra said. "You're here." Muriel looked at her hands for a moment, then up. "I have been thinking for the past 12 months about the day you left, about the ceremony, about standing at the back of the room," she paused, "about the angle I was standing at." Lyra was quiet. "I knew what it meant. I knew what the angle meant, and I maintained it anyway because—" Muriel stopped, started again. "Because you being the discarded one meant I was not. And I understood that even then. I understood that your diminishment was being used to protect my position. And I let it be used. And I said nothing, and I did nothing. And I watched you get on a transport ship with 50 people there to witness it, and I told myself that this was simply how things were." The wind came off the ridge, cold and direct, moving through the aspens. "Watching Callum today," Muriel continued, "in that examination room, the way he sat in that chair for 4 hours and never moved. The way he stepped forward without anyone asking him to." She met Lyra's eyes. "I have been married for 16 years, Lyra. I have a husband who is capable and respected and who has never once in 16 years simply sat beside me for 4 hours because I was in the room." She looked at her hands again. "I am sorry," she said. "Not because I was instructed to say it. Not because the political situation makes it strategic. Because I have been carrying the knowledge of what I did, or failed to do, for 12 months, and I would like to set it down if you will let me." Lyra looked at her sister. She had prepared herself, over the months, for many versions of this. For continued avoidance, for the formal acknowledgement that the court required when circumstances demanded acknowledgement, for the kind of apology that is constructed to be received rather than given. This was none of those things. This was a woman standing on a porch in Montana in the cold, having driven up a mountain road she didn't know how to drive, saying something true at the cost of something real. Lyra thought about Nova, about what she wanted her daughter to grow up knowing, not just about her parents' strength, but about what you do when someone stands in front of you with something genuine and difficult in their hands. You receive it properly. You make space for it. "Come inside," Lyra said. "It's cold." Muriel's face did something complex and then settled into something simpler and better. "Yes," she said. "Okay." The message from Valos arrived 3 days after the delegation departed. It came through a channel Lyra had not seen used before, not the imperial diplomatic frequency, not the advisory council line that Drevak had used, but a direct personal transmission registered to the Empress's private communication authorization. The kind of channel that bypassed every intermediary. The kind of channel that an Empress used when she wanted to be certain she was speaking only to the person she was speaking to. Lyra read it at the table near the south window in the early morning before Callum was up. It was short, not warm. Varathan was not a woman who had learned warmth, or if she had unlearned it in the decades of sitting on a throne where warmth is a vulnerability. But it was direct in a way that the Empress's communications had never been with Lyra. No court language, no formal register, no second-person collective that turned a daughter into a committee. The Advisory Council authorization issued under Lord Dravak's seal on the matter of the Earth examination has been rescinded. It was issued without my knowledge or my approval. Lord Dravak has been removed from the position of Chief Advisor to the throne, effective as of this transmission. Your daughter carries imperial bloodline. She carries it in a world that is not ours, through a means we did not understand and cannot claim. I will not pretend this is simple for me. I am not skilled at simplicity. You are well, it appears. The physician's reports indicate the child is healthy. I am I find that I do not have a word for what I am about that. Perhaps that means something. An official channel for communication between Earth and Valos will be established through your office, at your convenience, if you are willing. There was no signature. There did not need to be. Lyra read it twice. She sat with it for a long time in the quiet kitchen, with the early morning light coming thin through the south window and the sound of the creek somewhere below the house, slow in the winter cold. Juravac, who had arranged her departure with a speech in a secondary hall before 50 carefully unsmiling faces had been ended by a private transmission. The man who had calculated that she was a piece with no moves had been removed from the board by the very move he thought he had made in sending her here. She felt no triumph at this. What she felt was something quieter, the particular closure of a chapter that had been open for a very long time. Her mother would not apologize. She had known that for years, known it the way you know things about the people who shaped you, not because they told you directly, but because you spent long enough inside the particular weather they created. Varathan was a woman who had made herself into a throne, and thrones did not apologize. They adjusted, they recalibrated. At best, they acknowledged. This was acknowledgement. It was also something more, something that lived in the words I find that I do not have a word for what I am about that. A woman who had run an empire for 30 years admitting, in a private transmission to her third daughter, that she had encountered the edge of her vocabulary, that something had happened that her existing language was insufficient to contain. That was not nothing, it was not everything, it would never be everything. But Lyra was not, she had discovered over the past year, a person who required everything. She was a person who had learned to accurately assess what was real and decide what to do with it. What was real was this: her mother had written to her directly, had removed Dravac, had asked, in the closest register to asking that Varathan was capable of, whether a connection was possible. She would write back. Not this morning, she would think about it first, the way she thought about all important things. But she would write back. She would build something from what was available, which was not everything, but was real. And real was enough to begin with. She folded the transmission, set it on the table, and went to make coffee. Nova arrived on a morning in early October. The aspens around the house had turned gold the week before, the way they always did. Suddenly, as though they had been deciding all summer and had finally committed. The mountains carried their first new snow on the upper peaks. The creek was slower than in spring, but still moving, talking to itself in the low, specific way it had in the fall. The eagles were still on the ridge, catching the last of the strong autumn thermals before the season shifted beneath them. Lyra had been ready for 2 weeks. Not anxious, ready. She had learned the difference over the spring and summer, in the process of preparing for something that had never been prepared for before. Anxiety was the state of a person who was uncertain of their ground. Readiness was the state of a person who had checked their ground and found it solid, who had done the work that could be done and was now simply waiting for the moment that the work had been building toward. The labor was 8 hours. Margaret Holt and Ethan Cross had been planning for this for months, working alongside Sorath, who had remained on Earth after the November examination, nominally for research, actually because he had discovered that he was not finished being fascinated and had no intention of leaving before he understood more of what he was looking at. The three of them had spent weeks building a protocol that drew from 2 civilizations worth of medical knowledge, combining what Valine obstetric science knew about silver skin physiology with what human medicine understood about genetic hybridity and the particular demands of an unprecedented birth. It was, as Sorath had said more than once in the months of preparation, the most interesting medical problem he had encountered in 70 years of practice. Callum was there the entire time, not performing presence, not managing the situation or hovering at the edges with the anxious energy of someone who wants to help but doesn't know how. Simply there, in the way that he had been simply there for a year, the steady, unhurried, available presence of a person who had decided a long time ago that being present for the people he loved was the thing he was willing to organize his life around. When Nova arrived, the room went quiet. Not the silence of shock or uncertainty, The silence of a room encountering something that is exactly what it was supposed to be. And that is, despite that, more than anything anyone had imagined. She was small, smaller than a human newborn, larger than a Valine one, which put her at a point that existed only for her, that had no prior category, that was its own new category invented at the moment of her arrival. Her skin was silver, not the cold silver of the imperial homeworld, but something warmer, with a depth to it that caught the room's light and gave it back altered, as though the light that went in and the light that came out were not quite the same light. Her hair was dark, fine, already forming a shape that was entirely her own. Her eyes, when she opened them and looked at the room with the unfocused, complete attention of someone encountering everything for the first time, were brown with silver moving through them, or silver with brown depending on the light, depending on the angle, as though the color itself had decided to remain both things at once and saw no reason to choose. Lyra held her daughter for the first time. She held her and looked at her, really looked at her, with all of the careful, precise attention she brought to the things that mattered most, and felt something complete itself. Not dramatically, not with the force of revelation. The way a sentence completes itself when the last word arrives and you understand that every word before it had been building toward exactly this. "Hello, Nova," she said softly. The baby looked at her with those impossible eyes. In the chair beside the bed, Callum was crying with the complete unguarded openness of a man who had stopped caring whether anyone saw him cry. And Lyra looked at him for a moment over the top of their daughter's head, and the look between them contained everything that the past 14 months had been. The morning coffees and the evening sauces, the journal left open on the table, the government men on the porch, the kitchen in October when the world had shifted on its foundation, the 12 days of preparation, the room in the federal facility where she had stood at the forward edge and held her ground, and everything that the years ahead would be, and the specific, unrepeatable fact of this room on this morning in this life that neither of them had planned and both of them had built. Sorath approached slowly. He stood at the edge of the circle of the moment, waiting, and Lyra looked at him and nodded, and he came forward and took Nova with the hands of a physician who has held thousands of newborns and knows exactly how to do it. He held her and looked at her face with those wondering eyes that had been appearing more and more often on a face that had spent 70 years practicing certainty. "I have spent 70 years believing I understood what was possible," he said. His voice was not steady, and he did not appear to feel the need to make it steady. "I have delivered many children in my life. I have written the texts that define what a child can be. I thought I knew the edges of it." He looked at Nova for a long time. "This child is what happens when you are wrong about the edges." Nova reached up with one small fist and closed it around Sorath's finger. The old physician made a sound that Lyra had never heard from a Valine before. It sounded like something being set down, something heavy, carried for a long time. The sound of a person who has spent their life in the country of certainty, discovering at the end of a long career that the neighboring country is better. The weeks after Nova's birth arranged themselves around her the way all life arranges itself around a new center of gravity. Not suddenly, not by announcement, but through the gradual reorientation of everything else. Margaret Holt came to the house every few days in the first month, checking Nova's development with the meticulous care of someone who understood that she was writing the first chapter of a medical literature that did not yet exist. Ethan Cross visited weekly, his excitement barely contained beneath the professional surface, his notebooks filling with observations that he handled with the reverence of someone who knows they are holding something that will matter for a long time. Sorath stayed. There had been some conversation at the beginning of December about his returning to Valos. His official research period had concluded, his imperial commitments were waiting. He had listened to the argument for his return with polite attention and then informed his contacts on Valos that he required an extended research posting on Earth and that they were welcome to dispute this if they wished, and no one had disputed it, because Sorath's authority in his field was absolute enough that the Empire found it easier to accommodate him than to argue. He ate dinner at the house on the hill twice a week. He sat on the porch with Lyra in the mornings and watched the eagles and asked questions about human concepts that he was still working through. Not the technical questions, but the philosophical ones. What did it mean to choose someone? How did you know when a connection was real rather than convenient? Whether love was, as the old Valine text categorized it, a biological artifact, or whether it was something else entirely. Lyra answered as honestly as she could. Sorath listened the way she had come to understand he listened, with the full attention of someone who has decided that understanding matters more than being right. Muriel called from Valos on the 15th of every month. The calls had started formally, stilted with the careful distance of two people learning to speak to each other across a gap that had been maintained for so long it had acquired its own structure. By the third month, they had become something easier. By the fifth month, my Muriel had started asking about Nova with the specific, invested curiosity of a person who was beginning to understand what it meant to be an aunt and was finding she had opinions about it. She sent gifts, small, beautifully made things, a mobile of crystal spheres that caught the light in Nova's room, a soft blanket in the Valine weave that was simultaneously the finest thing in the house and apparently standard for Valine infants. A book of illustrated Valine mythology that Muriel had held since childhood, sent without explanation, the gesture making its own statement about what she was choosing to pass forward. Lyra wrote back after every call. She wrote about Montana and Nova and the eagles and the way the winter had settled into the valley. She wrote about small things. She was teaching her sister, without saying so directly, what it was to communicate without a political purpose, to speak simply because the other person was there and worth speaking to. It was slow work. It was, she had decided, worth the pace. The message from her mother came on the 20th of December through the same private channel as before, shorter than the first one. A question framed in the stripped-down language of a woman who was learning, at 60 years old, a new way of speaking. I have been informed that the child laughs often. I was told this by Sorath, who tells me many things I did not expect him to tell me. He seems changed. I have not decided how I feel about that. Is she well? Lyra sat with the message for a long time. Then she wrote back. She is very well. She laughs before she can help it. I think you would find her interesting. She sent it before she could reconsider. Then she sat back and looked at the words on the screen for a moment and felt something that was not quite hope, but was in the same neighborhood as hope, occupying the adjacent territory. She closed the screen and went to find her daughter. Nova's first birthday arrived on a morning of thin October gold, the aspens in full color, the mountains sharp and clear in the cold air, the world having completed one full turn around the sun since the morning everything changed. The yard filled by mid-morning. Nora was there, having organized the event with the cheerful organizational determination she brought to everything, carrying the cake herself because she had made it and was not willing to trust it to anyone else. A chocolate construction of some ambition that she had been discussing with Lyra for 3 weeks. The neighbors from the valley and the mountain road came in the way that communities come together around the things that belong to all of them, with food and stories and the particular ease of people who have been glad for something long enough that the gladness has become ordinary. Earl from the diner came with his wife and a homemade jar of honey and the information that he had told everyone at the diner about Nova's first words, which had not yet happened, but which he was clearly planning ahead for. Sorath sat in a chair near the aspen grove with a cup of tea, watching the yard with the expression of a man who has arrived, after a long journey by a circuitous route, at the exact place he needs to be. He had brought a gift, a small object from Valos, a carved thing in silver that was apparently a Valine good luck charm for new children, and which he had given to Nova with a gravity that suggested he had been thinking about the gift for some time. Muriel appeared on the screen that Callum had set up on the porch table, calling from Valos, her face in the afternoon light of the homeworld while it was morning in Montana. She was wearing something less formal than her usual court presentation. She looked, Lyra thought, like a person who was practicing being more comfortable in her own expression. She's gotten bigger, Muriel said, looking at Nova on the screen with the undisguised investment of someone who had been watching this child grow through a screen for a year and had opinions about every development. Children do that, Lyra said. I knew that, Muriel said. I have 3. She stopped then. She looks like you, around the eyes. Lyra looked at her daughter, who was at that moment regarding a butterfly, with the focused, complete attention that she brought to all new phenomena. She laughs like Callum, Lyra said. On the screen, Muriel smiled. It was the real kind. When Nora brought the cake out, the yard gathered around it the way yards gather, spontaneously, with the collective instinct of people who know a moment when they see one. Nova looked at the cake with the concentrated scientific interest she brought to all new phenomena, conducted a brief assessment, and made her decision. She destroyed it with both hands. The yard laughed. All of it, all at once, the way groups laugh when something is genuinely funny, not socially, not because it is expected, but from the chest, involuntary, the sound of people who are all inside the same moment together. Soreth laughed with the rest of them, which was something Lyra would remember for a long time. The sound of a 73-year-old Valine physician laughing in a garden in Montana at a cake-covered child, because the world had turned out to contain things he had not anticipated. Nora was already moving toward Nova with a cloth, laughing too hard to be efficient about it. Callum was laughing and crying at the same time, which was something he did now, Lyra had noticed. The two things arriving together, his feelings not bothering to stay in separate categories anymore. She reached over and took his hand. He held it. Nova, frosting on her face in both hands, looked around at the people who loved her with those brown and silver eyes and laughed. Thus, the laugh that was entirely her own, that had no prior category, that existed in the space that had been made for it by everything that had come before some. That evening, after the guests had gone and Nova was sleeping the deep, total sleep of a child who had given everything she had to the project of her birthday, Lyra and Callum sat on the porch. The aspens had gone still in the cold. The creek was quiet below the hill. The stars were appearing in the dark sky above the ridge, one by one in the way they always appeared, not rushing, not announcing themselves, simply becoming visible as the darkness deepened enough to show them. Somewhere in the direction she was looking, measured in years of light, was Valos. She thought about the girl who had stood in the great crystal hall with her hands at her sides, watching her mother look at a point past her left shoulder. She thought about the night in the corridor, the voice through the door, the particular quality of the darkness before she had decided not to give it what it wanted. She thought about 12 days on a transport ship reading files about a species she was being sent to as an insult. And the moment Earth had appeared in the viewport, blue and alien and still in the middle of becoming itself. She thought about a bow on a landing pad in November, unhurried and sincere from a man who hadn't needed to mean it and had meant it anyway. She thought about the journal left open on the side table, about a kitchen in late October when the world shifted, about standing at the forward edge of a room and finding, in that moment, that she was exactly who she needed to be. She thought about all of it, the full length and weight of it, and felt it in proportion, not as a wound anymore, not as a scar, but as the specific shape of the path that had brought her here, every wrong turn included, every moment of looking away from something that hurt, every night of keeping her hands at her sides. All of it had been, in some sense, she was still learning to articulate, necessary, not because suffering is redemptive in the abstract, but because this particular path had led to this particular porch, on this particular night, next to this particular person, with their particular daughter sleeping inside. She would not have traded any of it, not even the parts that had broken her, because she had not, in the end, been broken. She had been unmatched. Do you ever think about what would have happened, Callum asked? He was looking at the stars. If they'd sent someone else. Sometimes, she said, when Nova laughs, I think this particular laugh would not exist. This specific person. No one else could have been exactly this. He was quiet for a moment. She has your focus, he said. That thing you do when you decide to really look at something. She has your laugh, Lyra said. She laughs before she can help it. He turned to look at her in the dark, and she looked back at him, and the look between them had the quality that it had been accumulating for 2 years. Deep in particular, the look of two people who have seen each other in the difficult places, in the ordinary places, in the extraordinary places, and have continued choosing each other in all of them. They thought they were throwing something away, Lyra said. They thought they were winning a game that couldn't be lost, Callum said. They were wrong about what the game was. She looked back at the stars. They were playing for insult, for the satisfaction of discarding something and watching it stay discarded. She paused. They never understood that the discard was the beginning, that the moment they let me go was the moment I was finally free to become what I actually was. She placed her hand on his the way she had learned to, not as a practiced gesture, but as the simple, natural expression of wanting contact with someone who is the exact right person, in the exact right place, at the abrupt right moment. They gave me this, she said. Every part of it. They threw me away and gave me everything. Above them, the Montana sky was completely clear, the way it gets in October when the warmth has finished and the air has nothing left in it but cold and stars, more stars than she had ever seen from the palace, where the light of the silver cities washed the sky out to a pale suggestion of itself. Here, this far up the mountain, with no city light for 50 miles, the sky was the full thing, dense and layered, ancient light arriving from distances that made the political concerns of empires feel, momentarily, precisely as small as they were. Not worthless, not meaningless, but small. The creek ran quiet below the hill. The aspens stood still in the cold. The eagles were settled on the north ridge, roosted for the night, patient in the way that things are patient when they have learned to trust the thermals. Nova slept inside with the completeness of someone who is exactly where she belongs. And Lyra Voss, the princess who had been sent as a joke, the daughter who had been turned toward the wall and forgotten, the woman whom an empire had decided was worth nothing and had therefore given to strangers, sat on a porch in the mountains of Montana and looked up at the stars that were older than every cruelty and every carefully maintained angle of avoidance, and knew in the way that becomes permanent that she had always been worth everything. She had just needed to land somewhere willing to find that out. And somewhere up there, in the light that took years to arrive, an empire was learning, slowly, imperfectly, in the halting way that large things learn, that the greatest things are not built from what you keep. They are built from what you were foolish enough to let go.